Hello, all. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for Transportation Electrification, Infrastructure, and Stimulus. My name is Simbiat Yusuf, and I will be moderating this webinar today. And we hope you are all staying healthy. Attendees, please be sure to submit all your questions through the attendee chat. Our webinar slides and presentation will be shared shortly after the webinar today. So stay tuned for all of that information. We will also share some additional resources from our speakers as well. Today, our speakers will discuss the transportation electrification ecosystem working together towards a collective goal for clean, affordable, and equitable energy policies. And before we start today, we'll do a little bit of an introduction for some of our new attendees. Fourth, we are a nonprofit trade association advocating for electric, shared, and smart transportation. We work in four main focus areas, which are industry development, demonstration project, advocacy, and consumer engagement. Every day we work to advance electric, smart, and shared transportation. You can find more information about Fourth, our membership, and our events on our website at fourthmobility.org. As you may all know, EDTA, the host and organizer of EVS 33, has made the unfortunate but necessary decision to cancel EVS 33 due to the COVID pandemic. And due to the cancellation of EVS, Fourth is going to be hosting 5 engaging webinars to cover the roadmap panel sessions. They will be held from June 15th through the 19th, and we will also be including some information regarding the webinars on our follow-up email. And look forward for the roadmap standalone event starting June 29th through 30th of 2021. So please save the date. And we hope you can join the virtual National E-Mobility Equity Town Hall on May 28, 2020 at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. This town hall will be presented by EV Hybrid Noir and Fourth, and this will be in partnership with the California Air Resources Board. We'll also be including that in our recap email. The National E-Mobility Equity Conference presented by Fourth and EV Noir has been rescheduled for November 20th, 2020. You can also find more information on that on our website. Our speakers today are Jeanette Shaw, Senior Director of Public Affairs and Policy at Fourth, Jonathan Levy, Senior Vice President of Business Development at EVgo, and Román Partida-López, Environmental Equity Legal Counsel at the Greenlining Institute. Jeanette works to develop transportation electrification and e-mobility legislative and regulatory policy for Fourth. She's previously served as the Vice President of Government Relations, Executive Director, and as an organizational development consultation for several high-tech companies and nonprofit organizations, including National Semiconductor Technology Network and the Oregon Wine Growers Association and the Oregon Wine Board. Jeanette holds an executive MBA from Stanford University and a Bachelor of Science from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Jonathan manages the EVgo team responsible for revenue generation and strategic partnership, site acquisition, network planning, public funding, and advancing transportation electrification market developments. Prior to joining EVgo, Levy was the Director of Policy and Strategy at Vision Ridge Partners, an investment firm focused on sustainable real asset based in Boulder, Colorado. Román is the Environmental Equity Legal Counsel with the Greenlining Institute. He works to ensure that low-income communities of color have a seat at the table and see direct benefits from climate investment to help improve air quality and economic opportunities within the communities. And as a reminder, we ask you to please submit all your questions via the attendee chat or the Q&A function, and we will get to them after all of our speakers present today. And with that, I will pass it along to our first speaker of the morning, Jeanette Shaw, who will present on the roadmap to achieve a stronger and cleaner economy. Jeanette.
Thank you, Symbiote, very much, and very excited to be on this panel with Román from the Greenlining Institute and Jonathan from EVgo. So thank you very much. And with that, just want to launch into some of you may know, Forth's work has been grounded with hands-on experience. We base it on innovation, also hopefully with some disruption, and we do this work via collaboration with a range of stakeholders. That's everything from auto OEMs to environmental organizations to nonprofits, universities, think tanks, and we really build coalition and consensus around listening and ensuring that within our consensus and collaboration that everybody has a voice. And you'll see within this call, there's several different stimulus proposals that are emblematic of our work and the work of others. And with that, with Forth's mission, as we all know today, which is incredibly unfortunate that we're all been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, this pandemic, that really, first and foremost, we want to ensure that we prioritize public health and frontline workers. And in doing so, when we look to how we come out of this pandemic, we also want to ensure that we can innovate and not maintain the status quo. And also to ensure that we apply an equity lens to our policy proposals as we really seek to historically address those that have been wronged, but also that we can move more efficiently and cleaner so we can maintain both the environment that has been transformed that we've all seen the last couple of months, which is going to be vital as we move forward. And also, as Congress looks to rebuild and stimulate the economy, there's going to be many different conditions. There's going to be different entities that are going to be urging major investments. You'll note through, of course, this webinar and several others we'll have coming in the next couple of months at Forth that we are really promoting innovative, clean transportation stimulus package that will put Americans back to work, will increase America's competitiveness, as well as protect the health and climate. And I'm sure, of course, with all of us, most of us at home, and a nod to all those who still need to go into work or are considered essential, we have seen multitude of deaths. In reviewing the newspapers, which of course has not been pleasurable for any of us any time during the day, but we really want policies that once we move out of this pandemic, want policies that will deliver not only sustainable recovery but an equitable one, particularly as the soaring unemployment is reaching approximately 30 million here in the US alone, and that figure may have changed today again. This really represents the highest rate of unemployment since the Great Depression, and we know it disproportionately has affected marginalized communities and communities of colors. And in this webinar, you'll hear from Jonathan and Román. They'll provide a snapshot of the policies that will assist both the US economy to regain momentum, but also to do it in sustainable and equitable ways, as well as to ensure that we as individuals can get back to work. And as probably most of you on this call know, that within the clean transportation economy, there's approximately 3.4 million people who are employed. So to get all of us back working and into this arena would be certainly helpful to do in a more quickly manner. And given that, the transportation electrification arena, of course, is ready to assist in uplifting America towards that recovery. And we've seen that recovery happen in a couple of different ways, both within congressional, let's see if I can advance the slides here. There we go. Congress has been very busy. In the last 2 months, they've passed $2.4 trillion worth of stimulus packages for the COVID relief. And that's assisting Americans both directly financially, but also assisting businesses and industries that are, of course, grappling with this economic disruption. And we understand that there's a potential stimulus package that will be directed towards states and cities. It could be introduced as soon as this Friday in the House. And after that, we're very hopeful and have been promoting that there indeed be an infrastructure stimulus bill. And we think that'll potentially be mid to late June that will help start the economy and, of course, be based on transportation, clean fuels, electrification. So we've seen these two different packages, and multitude of different organizations, of course, have now stepped up to the plate and said, what do we need to do within an infrastructure policy package? And here's a graphical depiction of just a few of those organizations that have put forth transportation stimulus proposals. Obviously, some are based on energy security, on economic growth, environmental sustainability, equitable resource distribution, are all within these proposals, and Fourth has been happy to collaborate with a good many of these that are listed here. As we go forward with infrastructure policy proposals, the stimulus is really to introduce increased investments in manufacturing within light, heavy duty, and medium vehicles, in addition to increasing both incentives and credits. There's a number of good programs out there as far as California's Clean Cars for All program or Oregon's EV rebate program for additional EV incentives for charge ahead rebates for low income individuals. And also, we want to ensure that the clean vehicles can charge up when needed and charging is available to all who don't have driveways or who don't have garages. So we definitely want to ensure within the stimulus infrastructure spending and investments that there's this equitable lens and investment that happens in communities. Continuing on with a few of the policy proposals, and of course we'll go have a deeper dive into these. The stimulus package would also ensure that there are transit that support both urban and rural communities, and also to ensure that the workforce is sustained through federal programs to continue, whether it be DERA, which is the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, or even increase funding for the Low or No Emission Program. And we certainly want to extend the federal vehicle tax credit as well as the increased eligible cost cap. That will help get the industry's 3.4 million people back to work. So with all great stimulus packages, of course, we need to ensure that those dollars flow back to states, and states will need to also ensure that one's helping their individuals with health, but also how do we ensure that the package after the relief package, which will provide pandemic-related costs and lost tax revenue, help provide back funding for those. We need to ensure that the infrastructure bill will also increase funding for clean cities projects as well as electric highways, such as those as the West Coast Electric Highway, which we have here on the West Coast, which goes from Southern California all the way up to British Columbia. And with that, I'd like to turn this over, because at this point we need to be creative and innovative. We need to fund pilot and demonstration projects. And for a deeper dive into some of these policy stimulus ideas, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jonathan. And Jonathan's had DC experience on the ground during the 2008 recession, working in Congress passed IRA and invested in shovel-ready projects. And then we'll turn it over to Román to review an equity framework for a future clean transportation stimulus package. So with that, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jeanette. And you are right. I was in DC in 2008 and shifted from the Hill to the Obama administration in 2009. And so I did have a bit of a front seat to some of the $30 billion of clean energy investments during the Recovery Act. And I think part of what Jeanette just hit on that you'll hear from Román and me as well is that these crises and the responses to them have to be cross-cutting, because there's a public health crisis, obviously, there's an economic impact that is massive, there's a broader infrastructure need we've had in this country for a long time anyway, and we have to be positioned to recover from those things, put people back to work, make sure we're addressing the climate crisis, and in doing all of those things, be consistent about being cognizant of the impacts on disproportionately impacted communities and having a line of sight towards equity and environmental justice. Just to start, for those of you that are unfamiliar, EVgo is the nation's largest public fast charging network with more than 800 fast charging locations, more than 1,300 individual fast chargers across 34 states. We're now at the point where more than 115 million Americans live within a 15-minute drive of an EVgo fast charger. And we've been doing this for quite some time, so we often talk about being both a first mover and a first learner in the EV charging space. And the good news is that things have come a long way since the early days of not just the EV1, but then the evolution through the i3 and the Leaf. Now we're at a point in the market where we have longer range, lower cost cars like the Leaf Plus, the Kia Niro, the Chevy Bolt, the Model 3, and all of those things make it more and more important that we are helping accelerate the uptick of electric vehicles and decarbonize through transportation electrification. Right now, though, what we're seeing is that despite the great growth, EVgo grew 40% in California last year and continues to install around the country, and other networks are as well. We've had a really, obviously a massively disruptive event in COVID. Just within our sector, and Jeanette hit some of the high-level numbers on the people participating in the clean energy economy as of March, and so this is now outdated, but we'd already had 12,300 unemployment claims just in clean vehicles, and we're seeing the ramifications across the space, whether it's micromobility with the layoffs that have been happening at Bird and Lime, with some of the shifts that have happened at some of the transportation networking companies, and big economic changes. One of the things that is often underappreciated, particularly in the policy arena, is that the airlines have been out in front about how COVID and travel restrictions have hit them. They're not the only ones that are very much travel exposed. For owners and operators of charging infrastructure like EVgo, we deploy infrastructure for drivers to use, and we generate revenue off of use of those assets. That aligns us very well with our customers, because if the chargers are on and operational and working, the customer is happy and we have a revenue opportunity. If they're not working, the customer is not happy. So that alignment of incentive is something we feel very strongly about, but it does mean that during a time when fewer people are driving, you have a massive impact on the economics of such a network. So the chart at the right here is daily vehicle miles traveled since the beginning of March, and you can see obviously with a couple of dips and bumps and a little bit of an uptick happening in the past couple days, we've really seen this massive collapse of vehicle miles traveled, which has tracked with reduction in usage of networks. We've publicly talked about the fact that the utilization of our network is down by more than half. Other networks have said the same thing. We continue to try and make sure that we are deploying infrastructure, and we have been declared essential infrastructure in many geographies, although with some limitations and some restrictions. So it is difficult to continue to accelerate, and we've seen automobile manufacturers slow down and have to suspend production lines, and so we're constantly tracking impacts to the sector, because we want to make sure that as we recover out of Corona, we have the ability for everybody to grow sustainably and adopt those vehicles, but it means that the vehicles have to be there. We need to keep moving. The incentives have to be there, not to mention the impacts of macroeconomic trends of a recession, and will people have the purchasing power, which is why we really do need massive investment in infrastructure to hit this cross-cutting crisis of addressing both the immediate response, the recovery, and the long-term sustainable growth of the U.S. economically, environmentally, and from a public health perspective. So taking a step back and not just focusing on transportation, but looking at all clean energy, every clean energy transition that we've seen in the past decades has had a market transformation, where we started with higher costs and early scale, and as we moved down the technology pathway, we saw cost reductions happen, and we saw those happen both with scale and innovation. The same thing that we've seen happen in solar, wind, and batteries, as well as with LEDs over the past decade and a half, we're seeing again with the technology helping accelerate transportation electrification, including EV batteries themselves, but also the cost of the equipment that goes into the chargers themselves and other things that go with it. Well, in order to address climate change, we have to accelerate those things, which will require public-private partnerships up front. It will require policy. It will require leaning into the demands that we are seeing. As many of the folks on this call know, there are organizations like Forth, like EDTA, like the Lowe's, that are trying to break through with awareness, because there are not that many people that know about the number of EV models that are out there, their great benefits, the fact that they are available, and that they're becoming more and more available every year. And so we have to work together to make sure that we are supporting the industries that are decarbonizing, supporting the individuals that need it most, especially in disproportionately impacted communities, and that we're working together for the next page here to be a sustainable recovery, both environmentally and economically. So looking back, as mentioned, I was on the Hill in 2008, and then went to the Department of Energy in 2009. And if we look at what we did specifically in clean energy, there were a couple of different approaches. There were grants and loans that were kind of direct funding. There were tax incentives, as well as some regulatory regimes, especially on energy efficiency. There were other target standards and codes that are strong policy signals, and then some of it was just public awareness. We need all of the arrows in the quiver, and so as Congress is thinking about how we stop the bleeding, help cities and individuals directly with tax relief and unemployment insurance, we also have to think about what things look like coming out of a recession in a way that works for the climate crisis and works for clean transportation and all sorts of clean energy investments. If you take a step back and you just look at some of the biggest parts of the economy as a whole, automobiles themselves are 3% of U.S. GDP. Housing is about 15% of the global economy, and we know that we have work that we need to do on energy, we have work we need to do on transportation, and we have work we need to do on housing. Those three sectors, energy, cars, and housing, make up nearly a quarter of the economy. So we can have a huge impact on economic growth by building back better and more cleanly, and by making sure that as Congress is thinking about next steps, they're thinking about ubiquitous charging infrastructure. They're thinking about how we can build more housing, how we can retrofit housing, how we can do it all sustainably and have greater energy efficiency. And we can do it all through public-private partnerships by making sure that it's not just about the government writing a one-time check. If you look at cash for clunkers during the Recovery Act, it was about a $3 billion spend for about $13 billion of economic impact. That's a tremendous leverage opportunity so that the government isn't doing this alone, but rather you're inducing the additional private sector investment that allows us to not only scale, but to scale and perpetuate. So you get this cycle of innovation that continues, so we grow and grow as opposed to a one-time injection. Jeanette mentioned a couple of things, but on the job front, I think it's worth explicitly talking about what we're talking about. The picture here is from a groundbreaking and then an energization of an EVgo site in Compton, the first fast chargers in Compton. But the point behind this picture is really to take a look at all the people it takes to build a charging station. There's 115 EVgo employees. We have hundreds and hundreds of contractors from electrical design through installation, as well as ongoing networking and services, and through our partners to make sure that the network is working. You have the induced jobs that happen in the local economy. You have this amenity that attracts additional business to the taco place and the subway behind the chargers. All of these things are part of economic growth that is critical, especially right now coming out of COVID. In 2018 alone, the EV industry provided 275,600 jobs across a variety of sectors. There was an LAEDC report showing that the EV industry represented 1.6% of California's total employment, and had grown more than 0.9% ahead of the rest of the state's employment. So we see these are great opportunities for great jobs, for stable jobs, for things that have the win-win of delivering economically and environmentally. When we look at specifics on policy proposals, and I tried to hew to our Pacific Northwest anchor for Fourth here and have a ribbon cutting with our CEO, Kathy Zoy, and Governor Jay Inslee at the LeMay Auto Museum that was done in partnership with Fourth. But there's a lot of different policy proposals that are out there. And you're hearing them being echoed in from many different organizations: EDTA, Securing America's Future Energy, C2ES. A lot of people are getting behind this WRI. What are the tools and levers we have? And you really can bucket them into the same kind of areas as we discussed during the Recovery Act. What are the tax credits? The 30C tax credit is alternative vehicle refueling property. That's been traditionally a $30,000 tax credit for up to 30% up to $30,000 for charging infrastructure, natural gas refueling infrastructure, hydrogen infrastructure. But a tax credit during an economic downturn, even with the 10-year carry forward provision, is not going to help stimulate jobs immediately. Having more visibility of an extension beyond the end of 2020 for that, and turning it into a refundable tax credit, like was done in 2009 with 1603, where you get a cash payment in lieu of a tax credit, and increasing the size of it, as is being discussed by Senator Harper and Senator Alexander, that's a great stimulative opportunity to say, if you are installing a charger this year, next year, you're going to have cash as a rebate, basically, paid up front to you to show that you can do this now, and it helps advance the economics ahead of scale. Similarly, 30D, which most people know is a $7,500 EV sales tax credit, we can fix that as well by eliminating the caps, at least on a short-term basis, so that first movers are not punished for developing and deploying their vehicles first, and perhaps, again, to put it on the hood so that people don't have to wait for filing their tax returns to get a rebate, but rather it can be immediately stimulative. There are these grant opportunities, and Jeanette mentioned DERA. She mentioned the No and Low Emission Vehicle Program. There's also existing funding out of the state energy program, CMAQ, which is the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program, which is over at the Department of Transportation. DOE has state energy program dollars and Clean Cities. There's also legislation on a Clean Corridors bill out of the Senate EPW committee, as well as some metro charging programs like Congressman Tonko's bill in the House. All of these things have the same thrust, which is how do we fund and partner with the private sector to deploy additional infrastructure ahead of market. And that's going to be a way to put people back to work and build an economy that works for all of us, including by making sure we're hitting those communities that are underserved, those communities that are rural and ex-urban, all of those folks where it really does take partnership to make it work. I already mentioned cash for clunkers, but it's really worth redoubling that and taking a look at how to make it work even more cleanly by having an escalator for zero emission vehicles. And then there are all sorts of non-financial levers that can happen at the state level, the local level. We've seen HOV lanes be very positive in California. We've seen what Seattle has done be very effective, where we're helping electrify rideshare by having a minimum threshold of what you have to have a hybrid or better in order to do pickup at SeaTac Airport. Similarly, we see California working to accelerate the electrification of fleet through SB 1014, and there are great opportunities, especially in the rideshare space, to get those high mileage drivers that can have a maximum impact on the environment because they drive 3 to 7 times as many miles as a personally owned vehicle, as well as the economic opportunity because you can access those jobs and you can access those clean vehicles through different partnerships in order to be accelerating the impact of one car that can give 20 rides in a day and turn over both the environmental impact of pollution on local communities as well as the awareness of the benefits of electric vehicles. So all of that is just one taste. I know we're going to have plenty of time for questions to go into the specifics, but I think it's really important that as people are engaging with their representatives in DC, as well as the state recovery packages, we know there's a panel in California, there's work happening in Illinois and New York. We recognize what worked in the past, what can continue working again, and that we keep this North Star of electrifying, cleaning up the grid, making sure we're working together and working collaboratively across communities to really have the benefits of electric for all. So I think that's it for me, and I will hand it over to Román for his next part of taking the baton.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Let me just make sure I have control here. Great. There we go. Yeah, so as Jeanette and Simbiat mentioned, my name is Román Partida-López, Environmental Equity Legal Counsel with Greenlining Institute. For those who are unfamiliar with Greenlining Institute, we're a racial and economic equity advocacy organization. And for the last 27 years, we've been working on redressing the impacts of redlining on low-income communities of color. I specifically work for the environmental equity team, where we work to address poverty and pollution at the same time, and creating a future where communities of color thrive, and race is never a barrier to opportunity. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to be spending our time talking through what you see here as far as what the purpose and outcomes will be. I want to really highlight the impacts that this pandemic has been having on low-income communities of color. I know Jeanette touched on that briefly as we started the discussion, but I want to dive a little bit deeper on why it's important that as we continue this work, we continue to center the needs of those most impacted. And once we talk about those impacts, I want to then share with you all a framework that we've been working on, that Greenlining has been working on as we think about recovery, right? Both for a short term, medium term, and then especially long term, right? What are some of the things that we should be considering as we build out these strategies and these frameworks? And these packages, so that again we continue to center equity in the needs of those most impacted. And lastly, I'll share with you all some of the stuff that we've been thinking about when we talk about a green stimulus, right, and those investments. Jonathan spent some time towards the latter part of his presentation talking through, I think, some good opportunities. And so we want to share and build on some of the stuff that has been already discussed, so that, again, we continue to think through how we're centering equity in the work that we're doing. So by now, y'all have already seen or heard of the impacts that this pandemic has been having on communities of color. Even though COVID does impact us all, the impacts have been uneven and have been felt the most by Black and Brown communities. From rising unemployment, housing inequalities, to broadband access in rural communities, this pandemic has only really magnified existing economic inequalities. Additionally, we've seen actions taken by both the federal and state governments to ease or eliminate environmental protections. This attack was already underway prior to the pandemic, but it's only really been accelerated and exacerbated by what we're going through right now. And again, low-income communities of color are the ones who face the brunt of these actions, and they're the ones who have already been exposed and continue to be exposed to high levels of pollution and socioeconomic impacts. And lastly, there's been a lot of conversation about supporting our essential workers, right? But when we think about what's been happening with our essential workers and the fact that there's been a reduction in transit services, both being reduced or cut, this is something that highly impacts our low-income essential workers who use transit as their main mode of transportation. Yet with these cuts, we continue to add additional burdens to those who need the most support right now. So I want to take an opportunity to just share an image to kind of drive what I've been discussing kind of a step further and add a visualization to it. I think it was mentioned earlier, right, that we've seen and heard some of these stories of like the change in air quality because of the fact that people are not driving as much. How much air was clean, or what air improvements we saw because there was less vehicles on our roads, less miles traveled. But again, these air quality benefits were not felt by all, again, especially in Black and Brown communities. As I mentioned, the relaxing of or suspension of environmental regulations has definitely been felt by our communities. And because more people are home and there's been an increase in demand for goods, and delivery goods, this has also meant that there's been higher action at ports and warehouses that are generally next to or in communities of color. And then lastly, there's been a huge and a major impact on small businesses, as they've been the hardest hit or one of the hardest hit by this pandemic. And even with services like the PPP, they've been unable to access these programs. This is specifically true for businesses of color, where, according to the Center for Responsible Lending, at least 90% of businesses owned by people of color have been or will likely be shut out of the PPP. So the image I shared here, which was developed by my colleague, Alvaro Sanchez, takes a look at 3 different maps. The first map you see on your left-hand side is a redlining map of Oakland. The one in the middle is California's CalEnviro screen. And the third one is the Alameda County Health Maps, right, which lays out COVID impacts in communities. And as you can see, these 3 maps are basically showing the same hotspots, right? From redlining maps to the COVID maps on the right, these maps are impacting the communities who have been impacted by redlining, have dealt with disinvestment, and continue to face these social and economic burdens. And so these systems that we currently operate in, this is showing us that the systems that we're currently operating in, built on white supremacy and forced inequality, are broken. And this is why the time is now for big and structural changes. Keep jumping. Because of this, we offer the following guiding principles and standards as an equitable framework for any funding or regulatory proposal meant to address the fallout and recovery of this pandemic. These principles and standards, we feel, provide an opportunity to embrace systematic transformation and meaningfully address the needs and concerns of priority communities of color, as we begin to recover from this pandemic and simultaneously prepare for climate-related impacts. Any recovery effort must deliver targeted and racial-conscious investments. These investments, again, must be targeted at those who are highly impacted and significantly address the needs of those that are facing high levels of pollution, pandemic, and climate change, particularly Latinx communities, Black, API, and Indigenous. Investments must facilitate and require community leadership and decision-making power. while providing a robust community engagement process. In this pandemic, and as part of this COVID-19 world, investments must also take into consideration the benefits that it's providing, but also avoid any intentional or unintentional burdens. They must not harm priority communities who are already experiencing significant socioeconomic, environmental, and health burdens. To achieve this transformation, investments must also comprehensively deliver better public health outcomes, environmental benefits, and economic opportunities, and therefore take this comprehensive approach, as Jonathan was mentioning early on. And we also must ensure that investments include funds for capacity building and technical assistance to support communities with the least resources and help ensure that they have access to programs and funding opportunities. Lastly, I want to point out that additionally, on top of these principles and standards I've mentioned, we should also take into consideration the 5 principles for a just COVID-19 relief and stimulus framework that was developed and backed by over 1,000 environmental justice, labor, and movement organizations. And these 5 principles focus on ensuring that health is the top priority for all people with no exceptions, that we're providing economic relief directly to the people, that we rescue workers and communities and not corporate executives, that we make a down payment on a regenerative economy while preventing future crises, and lastly, that we protect a democratic process that works for all. So as Jonathan previously mentioned and shared his experience, working as part of, having been part of the last recovery effort, I think as we think about any future green stimulus package, we have to ensure that we learn from the challenges of the previous act and ensure that the power of stimulus spending is working to build worker power and create opportunities for people to enter higher paying, stable jobs with family sustaining wages. Any financial assistance directed at specific industries must include pro-worker conditions to ensure that we're continuing to move forward. So as we think about a stimulus package that centers equity and builds worker power, here are now, we're going to be providing some recommendations for you all to consider. Jonathan already discussed several specific policy proposals, and you may have already seen some of the multiple concepts and letters that have been shared, building out a green economy or one that's focused on transportation and electrification. So given my remaining time, I just want to focus and highlight a couple concepts that haven't yet been discussed. And I should also note that these recommendations that I'm going to be going through are not exclusive to Greenlining. These are recommendations that have been shared and uplifted by other other social justice groups. And so, as I mentioned before, there's been a huge decline in transit ridership, and because services are being cut, there's a further strain on those who use the systems of public transit. There's further strain on those who use the system and on public transit agencies. If we're really going to address and prioritize the needs of those who are most impacted, we need to figure out transit. We need to work on restoring transit access. I've seen several articles now that talk about, with the decline of transit, how this could be an opportunity for car sales, especially EV car sales. And the last thing that we want to do is start pitting transit against EVs. So if we want to center equity and solve for the most in need, we need to ensure that we're making these investments and prioritizing transit. If we invest and create a zero-emission public transportation sector, we can see multiple benefits. A report stated that for every dollar invested in public transportation, it creates $4 of economic activity in the community. So ramping up federal spending to invest in zero-emission systems will create jobs, lead to long-term savings, and boost the economy of growing urban areas. Plus, it will help decrease pollution. The same can be said about charging deployment. But when we think about how we're deploying and prioritizing charging, we must complement these investments that are happening on the transit level, and also thinking about medium and heavy duty deployment, given that we will see high levels of return on that, both from job creation and environmental benefits. And lastly, if we really want to support essential workers, we need to do our part in ensuring that we are prioritizing their needs and investing in transportation options like transit, because the last thing we would want is for them to be forced to go out and buy a car when they're source of transportation has been transit. And so, and if we really consider them essential workers, we got to work on prioritizing them and not allow this to just be a one-time thing where after this pandemic, they become deprioritized. If we're critical, it will be critical that any green stimulus that is built out does not operate in silo. So as mentioned, we need to develop a comprehensive cost-cutting approach that we see, and we see this as an opportunity to advocate and advance other opportunities that will help create these green jobs. With the energy sector, efficiency is the fastest growing segment and already employs twice as many workers as the fossil fuel industries combined. And so for every 1 million invested in energy efficiency, that creates at least 8 full-time jobs, whereas 1 million invested into fossil fuels creates about 3. And so really prioritizing these opportunities around energy efficiency and renewables will be key as we continue to move forward. I mentioned earlier the need for broadband access. Having students be at home and then rely on broadband access is going to be critical to be able to ensure that they're having the same access that other folks are. And lastly, when we think about reforestation and restoration efforts, this is something that doesn't just happen, that needs to happen internationally. It can happen here. 60 billion trees could be restored in the US, both in rural and urban areas, according to a recent research. And 1 million invested in reforestation or forest management sustains about 40 jobs. So a federal investment of $4 billion could mean more than 150,000 jobs per year, as well as tons of carbon sequestration from the atmosphere. And lastly, when it comes to these potential investments, again, we got to continue to support green job creation. And so as we continue this discussion, it's going to be crucial that we continue to provide a just transition that benefits all workers, especially those in the fossil fuel industries, which could be, including some type of wage replacement for displaced workers, housing assistance, job training opportunities, health insurance coverage, pension support, and other priority job placement, so that we continue to address the potential burdens that will come on communities by working on this transition. So I just want to close by reiterating that we can't go back to normal. Since back when things were normal, we already had severe economic inequalities. As my colleague said in a recent blog, our goal in recovering from this pandemic and the economic crisis shouldn't be to get back to normal. Normal is a big part of the problem. Our goal must be to make the world a better place for everyone, because if it's not now, when? So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly. And I'll now turn it over to Jeanette.
Thank you very much, Román and Jonathan, for terrific presentations. I know Symbiot has queued up a whole host of questions that will be asked. We are going to potentially attempt to go live for the Q&A as well, depending on bandwidth issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Symbiot.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, Jonathan, and Román, and thank you all for attending. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I think it's fair to say the first question we will ask is, how can we make sure that with the stimulus and when we talk about recovery, that this is beneficial to a diverse community? This is going to be diverse. This is going to help all communities and not just one community. I will pose that to the speakers, and I will have you, Jeanette, go first, and we can go after that.
Great. And actually, Symbiot, I'm going to punt because I just unfortunately had an animal jump on my lap and then right back down. So I wasn't as tuned as I should have been.
Sure, I can go first, and then folks who are to chime in. I think for us, as we think about how we ensure that any type of stimulus package is addressing and benefiting all communities, is really kind of thinking through the framework we just talked through right now, right? Thinking about those principles and standards that we should take into consideration, and really centering the needs of those most in need. I didn't mention this during the presentation, but I think folks may be familiar with the curb cut effect, right? That was put out there by PolicyLink and Stanford. And basically what it says is that when you solve for the most in need, then solutions will come for the rest, right? You create a curb cut that helps the disabled community, then it helps all others, delivery folks, parents who use a stroller. So if we continue to have that mentality as we work on any type of stimulus package and we're addressing those needs first, then we can really find solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah, and look, I think some of this is building on looking at the core of the economics too. One of the things that's often underappreciated is that most people hear disproportionately impacted or disadvantaged communities and they immediately think inner city. But when it comes to transportation electrification, the dense urban environments are actually some of the best places to build public fast charging infrastructure. So there's already an economic incentive there. So the important thing is, how do we make sure we're capturing rural? How do we make sure we're capturing exurban? How do we make sure we're capturing all sorts of other folks? And I think the state policymakers have been a little bit better at this. Román's slides had a thing on CalEnviro screen. There's been an evolving standard in California and some good work in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere on, are there participation thresholds? Are there diversities of geographies and communities that are being served? And then how do we make sure that the opportunities are flowing through in a local community basis? Also, to go back to the first point in economics, if we look again at electrifying rideshare, Lyft's public documents have shown that about half of their rides either begin or end in a low to moderate income neighborhood. Partially that's where their drivers are coming from, but also partially where their riders are going to and coming from. So by making sure we're doing a data-driven approach to investing and electrifying where these communities need to be driven or picked up or whatever it is, we can make sure we're not just doing one level of cut at this, and we're being a little bit more inclusive. The other part of it is to make sure that we structure things accordingly. I think there's been a lot of controversy around 30D. Is it just incentivizing people to buy $100,000 EVs? And some of that was the structure of a first mover program where the early vehicles were more expensive. But figuring out, do we want to have extra kickers for used vehicles? Do we want to have extra kickers for people with an income below a certain threshold? Should we look at what California has done on their programs of working with grid alternatives to pair, if you're a low-income participant getting a used EV, you also either get a free L2 installed by grid alternatives or you get charging credit with grid alternatives and EVgo's partnership. I mean, there's a number of different ways to cut this to make sure the economic benefits are flowing through different communities.
Thank you. And the next question, which we had a lot from our attendees, was in regards to the Cash for Clunker program. So I would pose this to the question, and I would have you, Jonathan, go first, and then we can go through Jeanette and Román to discuss more about the Cash for Clunker program and any concerns, any lessons learned. What can we learn from that program as we're moving forward to recovery?
Yeah, so look, the Cash for Clunkers program was very popular amongst those that got it, unpopular amongst those that did not make the cutoff because it was only an 8-week program, had some challenges in terms of some of the automakers with their timing in terms of can they move the vehicles they want off the lot versus others. And there were questions raised about, did it pull forward or did it actually increase the total pie of vehicles being sold? Survey data from the DOT for those that participated in the program showed that they, on average, made the purchase decision 2.87 years earlier than they otherwise would have. So despite some of the other analyses that were out there, the actual survey participants were very direct that had a material impact in time in terms of accelerating their purchase. And even Brookings' analysis, which was pretty skeptical, included a very heavy positive contribution on carbon reduction. So, my view on this is that it's very clearly a way to help move cars quickly. And if you structure it correctly and you learn from the lessons of the past, we shouldn't just be looking for a 4 mpg improvement. What we should do is say, here's the threshold, everything under this threshold is a clunker. And if you go by a different order of magnitude and or you're hitting ZEV with an adder for zero emission vehicles, that's the right way to structure a program that can be meaningful. And again, I would learn from California's experience and do make it even better for those that are coming from a disproportionately impacted community or are below a certain income threshold, so that we're really driving that turnover. Part of the problem with cars, not just electric vehicles, but cars, is generally speaking, only people above a certain income buy new cars. Everybody else buys used cars. Well, we finally are starting to get used Leafs for very cheap. Model 3s coming off lease, Bolts coming off lease. there is finally now a market for those used vehicles. Policy should catch up to that and make sure that we're providing incentives for the used ones as well as the new ones.
Yeah, we dovetail, Jonathan, in those comments. And as some know, here in Oregon, we tried a similar program that we didn't quite call it cash for clunkers. And we did learn from some of the kind of structural changes that need to happen in California, and we had input those into the proposal. What we did run across, and perhaps we did not do our homework well enough, was the fact that we did not speak with communities of color or those otherwise maybe perhaps impacted more heavily. And there was concern from a particular organization that a cash or clunkers program would unfairly target disproportionately low-income individuals or communities of color. So therefore, we did not include it within the Oregon rebate program, but it's something I certainly think, given collaboration, given continued discussion, that we can hopefully move forward one day, particularly now, as Román's slide said, now is the time not to go back to normal.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is that, yeah, here in California, we do have our Clean Cars for All program that is very similar to the Cash for Clunkers program that we're talking about, where I think the difference here is that when we think about Clean Cars for All is a people-centric approach, right? Rather than really thinking about, stimulating the auto manufacturing economy. So if we're thinking about it in that way and really focusing in on how we're creating and developing programs that are targeted at the folks that are most in need, then I think we can really have this conversation about that opportunity. The last thing I'll just add is that one of the things that I really like and appreciate about the one here in California is that it also has this other component for an alternative mobility option, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get rid of your car to get into another car. And even though I know we're talking about developing those economic opportunities through this industry or through this work, it does have that option, right? And I think that's what people want, being able to have options to figure out how to best engage in this process, whether it's buying a new car because their transportation needs require them to have a car, or getting rid of their car, and again helping stimulate the transit, the transit side of things or the mobility side of things, because that is also in need of support.
Thank you. And as we're talking about stimulus and recovery, we keep talking about single occupancy vehicles. Can we elaborate a little bit about electrifying transit, school buses, micromobility, and how that could all be roped into the recovery or stimulus as we're moving forward post-COVID? And I will have you, Jeanette, go first.
Certainly. Certainly, we need to electrify both transit and the school bus fleets. And in these proposals that have been put forth, there's a whole host of different mechanisms to do that. I mean, look, with the 475,000 school buses in the United States alone that are going through routes every day impacting children's health, that alone should be sort of a stimulus just to move us forward. But there's also, if you look at both 66,000 public transit buses that are going through the United States, and of course we know currently right now transit's going to be heavily impacted due to ridership reductions and revenue. So we definitely need to see, and this could be an opportunity to Jonathan's point about where a public-private partnership should come in, but it should be a priority certainly within the stimulus infrastructure funding.
Yeah, I put the acronym HVIP on my slide and forgot to mention it, but the heavy duty vehicle incentive program in California was very quickly oversubscribed because A, there's great demand for electrifying buses, both transit for cities that are leaning in, as well as the school buses and other fleets. But B, the cost of the vehicles and the availability of the vehicles is still such that you need to have that incentive. So you do need to have that public-private partnership on both the vehicle and, frankly, on the infrastructure, given that the use cases are very different for buses than they are for light-duty vehicles. That being said, there is a great discussion happening in Congress about what do we do to incentivize medium and heavy-duty electrification. I think this ties, though, to some of the comments that were coming through the attendee chat. Do I think that we can get all of these things we're talking about today through this Congress and this administration? No, I do not. Do I think we need to try? Yes, I do. In fact, I think we have to because of the economic part, but also because we need to set the table for future action. We're not going to solve climate. We're not going to solve environmental justice in one shot, and we're definitely not going to solve it in one shot with the current composition in DC. But by having these ideas and advancing the ball on light duty, medium duty, heavy duty, employment opportunities, transportation electrification of fleet, then we can have these actions that can get picked up, piece by piece through this Congress, bigger hopefully in the next Congress, but also at state and local levels, so that we can make sure that we work things right. Like some of the existing funding, the CMAQ program I mentioned, state energy program money, those funds go from the federal government to states on a formula basis. There's also an opportunity through a highway bill that may or may not happen, but hopefully will, to get more money to the states on a formula basis. And then the states can do the right thing with them. I think that's part of this strategy, is present what makes sense, especially as it relates to growing sustainably and equitably, and then find a way to use different levers to get there. And frankly, everybody needs to make noise. Whether you're a local government, whether you're a business, whether you're an individual, you need to be banging a bit on your reps in DC and on organizations, and to help support what Force and EDTA and SAFE and others are doing by being advocates, because the only way that anybody is going to feel pressure to do the right thing here is if they're feeling the pressure from you all.
Yes.
Excellent plug for action.
Yeah, and with that call to action, this is posed to you, Jeanette, but I think all of our speakers can speak to this. How can we make sure we're working currently with our members, currently with other organizations, to make sure, as we're thinking of stimulus, how can we prepare for stimulus? So how are we working with our members currently? How should we be working with our members? How should we be collaborating? We all want this to be a collaborative effort. How do we do that?
Certainly. Thank you, Symbiote. And the good news is we're starting early. Us as a transportation electrification industry have been engaged for a number of years. It's much more popular now than it has been in the past, which is great. But we have been putting together proposals. We are happy to entertain additional ideas, additional proposals. As Román's slide said, we don't want to go back to the new normal. So if you have ideas, please reach out to us. We also have a policy committee at Fourth, where we've been creating a document that will assist both at the state level, multi-state level, but also at the federal level, with proposals, ideas, both from the rural, from equity and urban centers. And then, of course, you saw the list of different entities that all three of us are either members of or work closely with. So we definitely don't want to inhibit any ideas, want to have them thoroughly discussed and then brought forward, hopefully within this administration. If not, of course, we have another opportunity for the next.
Yeah, and sorry if you hear my baby crying in the back. It's about that time for a nap. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned early in my slides, I think, we have to take this comprehensive approach to the work that we're doing, right? And that means, checking in with some of our partners to see where they're at and where are they prioritizing. And even with organizations who may not be our partners that we work closely with, but maybe that they're EJ organizations who have identified what their priorities are, and we haven't connected with them. We need to start making some of those connections and start building some of those relationships and see where our priorities overlap, right? Because if we have those areas where we overlap, and now we can do advocacy together and really focusing in on a particular set of priorities, then that really helps move this conversation forward. And as Jonathan mentioned, like we need to make that noise, and that can help really make that noise. But again, all of that happens through a comprehensive process where we're engaging with others, and we're understanding and listening to what some of the other needs may be and prioritizing a handful of them so we can move that forward.
Yeah, I think Román just hit it on the head, right? And some of this is, don't assume that if it's a good idea, it's been heard or it's been heard enough. Even some of our biggest transportation electrification allies on the Hill have said, I can't deal with this now. Let's stabilize the economy, and then maybe we can talk about infrastructure. Or, yeah, we've got all the ideas we need, which is totally not true. So making sure that you are working with organizations like Fourth and the other ones that Jeanette mentioned, but also working through your own commercial arrangements, working through local civic organizations, working through a diversity of groups so that it's not just transportation electrification, but how do we build coalitions? On the 30C tax credit, we've been having conversations about, do we pair that with 48C, which is what the wind and solar guys care about, and 45Q, which is a carbon sequestration one, and maybe you get the drillers involved. Where are the other strange bedfellows coalitions, so that the ask for environmental justice is being paired with an economic message from a business organization or whatever that may be? So I think the answer is, everything. Like, you have to call yourself, you have to call with organizations, you should bring ideas to Fourth, and you should bring ideas directly to the Hill, and you shouldn't forget about state stimulus activities. You shouldn't forget about mayoral engagement and getting the allies that you have on a local level. Most big cities and every state have lobbyists in DC, and they're all at varying levels of activity. But, you know, when I was on the Hill, we would talk to the mayor of Chicago's DC office all the time. And I think this is a great time for every mayor and every governor to remind their lobbyists that transportation electrification needs to be one of the top priorities in a recovery, because this has to happen. It has to happen sustainably and equitably, and we need it as soon as possible.
Thank you all so much. We are right at 11 o'clock, and we will open it for one more question. And we've talked about recovery. We've talked about new funding. What can be done locally and at the state level without new funding that can still help promote recovery to all communities and still help further the industry as a industry ecosystem? What should we be looking at right now without new funding? And I will, yeah.
I think there's definitely benefits, I think, at the utilities, both from the IOUs, but the MUDs. I think they're, I would want to look there and investigate further if we're looking at potentially, given the parameters of the question, with no revenue. So just in the 30 seconds, that'd probably be the one quick area I'd start with.
Yeah, and I would just go back to supporting our essential workers, right? I think, you know, when we think about transit and transit access, you know, some of those buses are already operating. And even though for some transit agencies, they may not be ideal, but providing free services to transit to essential workers is something that we've been really focused in on and helping support. So taking that immediate action is, I think, one thing that helps put money back in people's pocket.
Yeah, and I would say two quick things. One is that there's a difference between no funding and no new funding, because there are things that we could take existing pots of money and repurpose, like we talk about with CMAQ or DERA or other things like that. And the second is, where are the opportunities for win-wins as it relates to smart regulation, whether that's incentivizing certain investments, again, that already exist into diverse communities, or whether it's you know, the SB 1014 work about creating an e-mile standard for rideshare and expanding this to other fleets. You could have a smart, well-crafted regulation that is about corporate fleets, rideshare fleets, municipal fleets, that says, you know, 20% of those miles are going to be zero emission, and we're going to ratchet that and ramp it to hit our local climate goals. That doesn't require new public funding, and it helps accelerate the demand curve and works as a win-win-win.
Thank you all so much. And if we did not get through to your question today, there will still be opportunities. We'll be sending a webinar recap. Feel free to connect with our speakers. We have their email listed here. And with that, I would like to say thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our awesome speakers today, Jonathan, Jeanette, and Román. This was definitely a very engaging topic, and we hope that you can join us next week on May 19th when we discuss what is the road ahead for electric car sales. We'll be joined by our Executive Director, Jeff Allen, Joel Levin, Chelsea Sexton, and John Volker, and they will highlight the impact of COVID-19 and what that impact is going to look like for electric car sales. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you with us next week.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Symbiote. Thank you, Jeff and Jeanette, for organizing, and Román, great to work with you. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you all. Bye-bye.